Welcome to this explainer. What if history's most terrifying judgment is actually the ultimate act of love? For centuries, the idea of the final judgment has meant fear and dread, right? But the texts we're unpacking today ask a pretty profound question. What if the Great White Throne is actually a perfectly calculated, completely necessary step toward universal reconciliation? Let's get right into it.
Okay, we're going to break down this deeply structured framework. We need to figure out what the Great White Throne Judgment really is, exactly which eon it takes place in, and why the author insists it's been totally misunderstood. We'll be looking at some incredibly detailed theological timelines to see exactly how this event fits into a much larger cosmic purpose and the succession of the eons.
Here's our roadmap for today. 1. Decoding the 5 eons. 2. The Great White Throne. 3. Who stands trial? 4. Being judged by their acts. And 5. The purpose, universal reconciliation. All right, Section 1. Decoding the 5 eons, mapping the timeline. So the source material leans heavily on this idea of a divine calendar. It argues that history isn't just some random sequence of events. Instead, it's perfectly mapped out into 5 distinct, separate eons. It's a highly structured way of looking at existence, It's bounded by a very defined beginning and a specific consummation. Grasping this macro view of time is absolutely crucial for making sense of the author's arguments regarding the final judgment. And vocabulary is totally key here. In this text, an eon isn't just a vague block of time, which is how we often hear the word age used today. No, an eon is a highly specific period separated by massive physical and moral cataclysms. The author insists we shouldn't just use that vague word age because an eon represents a distinct era with specific divine administrations and physical earthly realities. The boundaries between them are absolute. This brings us to exactly when the Great White Throne happens. It's literally the cataclysmic boundary separating the 4th eon from the 5th and final eon. The text presents it as this definitive bridge. Basically, the 4th eon, which is identified as the 1,000-year reign, has to conclude, and the old Earth must pass away before the new creation of the 5th eon can even begin. The author argues this specific boundary is the exact, necessary moment to settle all outstanding accounts. Moving on to Section 2, the Great White Throne, the event defined. Now, human tradition usually pictures a terrifying black throne of doom and despair, right? But the text is super careful to emphasize that it is specifically a white throne, white representing purity, light, and unblemished justice. The author argues we shouldn't view this as a place of endless torture, but actually as a seat of perfectly balanced justice, mercy, and ultimate divine correction. There are 5 really concrete facts the text lays out about this event. First up, the timing. It happens right during the recreation of the heavens and earth by fire. Second, the place is before the throne in a universal void. Third, the subjects are explicitly called the rest of the dead. Fourth, the basis of the trial is strictly their individual acts. And finally, the 5th fact, the immediate result is formal judgment and the second death. To avoid theological confusion, the source is really careful about separating different biblical judgments. For instance, it points out a stark contrast between the glory throne from Matthew 25, which is meant for living nations on earth, no resurrection involved, and the Great White Throne. The Great White Throne happens over 1,000 years later, it's exclusively for the dead, and it happens after the earth and heaven have literally fled away. So completely distinct events. Which brings us to Section 3, Who Stands Trial? The Subjects of Judgment. The author makes a really strong argument here that we can't just lump all of humanity into one big general resurrection. This specific judgment, it's reserved exclusively for the rest of the dead. That refers to unbelievers, basically the vast majority of mankind from Cain onward. According to the text, the righteous are totally excluded from this specific throne because, well, they were already raised in prior resurrections during earlier eon boundaries. To really grasp the state of the people standing there, we need to look at another major vocabulary shift in the text. The author draws a super sharp line between resurrection and vivification. Those at this throne, they only experience a temporary resurrection of their physical bodies. They are not granted vivification, meaning they don't get incorruption or immortal spirit life yet. They are brought back exactly as they were, mortal and ready to face their trial. Section 4. Judged by their acts, the nature of the trial. The text makes it clear that the judge doesn't just hand down a one-size-fits-all blanket sentence. Instead, the judge takes into account exactly which eon and which administration a person lived in. He looks at their mental equipment, their physical limitations, and the specific opportunities they actually had in their era. It's presented as a highly personalized, deeply nuanced review of their exact actions and unique circumstances. And here is a real game changer in the source material, redefining the actual concept of judgment itself. According to the author, judgment doesn't just mean endless punishment. The text points out that because our human courts are so focused on penalizing, we've kind of lost the original meaning. In these theological texts, divine judgment literally means to set right what is wrong. The whole goal is to correct the creature's attitude toward the Creator. That leads perfectly into Section 5, Purpose, Universal Reconciliation. The text asks a really fascinating logical question here, one that essentially drives the whole thesis. Why would God expend immeasurable cosmic power to resurrect billions of dead people, bring them before a throne, and judge them, if the only end goal was to send them right back into eternal suffering? The author uses this exact question to pivot to a totally different understanding of what God is actually doing. Think about it. The author argues that the orthodox view of eternal torment makes the resurrection completely irrational. If these people are already condemned, going through a massive trial is just, well, a farce. The text suggests that view turns the judge into a torturer of his own creations, which obviously contradicts the nature of a God of love. So there has to be a rational, purpose-driven reason for this major boundary event. Instead, we get this incredible conclusion from the source. It says that the object of all God's operations are rooted in love and fruited in reconciliation. This intense judgment isn't designed as a final damnation. Rather, the text positions it as the difficult but absolutely necessary preparation for total, universal reconciliation across the entire cosmos. You can actually see it mapped out as a four-step process. First, individuals face the judgment to acknowledge their specific guilt and failure. Second, that realization makes them see their desperate need for God's justice and grace. Third, the judgment acts to actually set them right and justify them. And fourth, this rigorous process formally prepares every single soul for the fifth and final eon, the consummation, where God ultimately becomes all in all. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. The source material presents a staggering reevaluation of divine justice. If this ultimate, terrifying judgment at the boundary of the eons is actually positioned by the author as a means of correcting wrongs, to bring absolutely everyone back into a relationship of love, how does that change the way we view justice, punishment, and reconciliation in our own world today? Thanks for exploring this with us.